Good morning, everyone. Hope we're all doing okay on this last day of the Christmas talks. Um, my name is Kieran Hicks. I'm a lecturer at the University of Lincoln, teach mainly on the games computing program, and the areas I kind of teach around are game design and kind of game implementation and development. And so today I've kind of got maybe a slightly different talk than a lot of the others that have happened this week, where this is more of a kind of a build along or a kind of pseudo tutorial, I guess, to the basics of 3D modeling. And so obviously many games nowadays are 3D, right? And we have to make assets, we have to make models to be able to make those games. And so during my time running an independent games company before I became a lecturer, I kind of had to self-teach myself a lot of basic modeling principles to be able to make those assets for the games. And so I figured today what I'd do is basically give a kind of intro to how to make basic models in a Blender. Blender's a 3D modeling piece of software that's open source and free to use. And so that's one of the reasons I quite like to teach through it, because again, everyone can have access to it. There's no fees or nothing like that. And so the kind of plan for today is we're going to make, I'm going to model and hopefully you're going to follow along either live or via the recordings afterwards. And we're going to make a Christmas-y scene. So we're going to make a couple of different Christmas models. And whilst we're kind of going through the process of making those models, I will just kind of be teaching some of the basics of Blender and some of the kind of basic modeling principles that we follow. One nice thing about any kind of 3D modeling is the principles are the same regardless of the tool you're using. So, you know, the knowledge of how to make a model inside Blender is pretty much the same as making a model inside 3ds Max or Maya or any other kind of modeling software that exists. The idea of, you know, how to subdivide models, how to extrude and perform all these different kind of modifiers is the same regardless. And so I'm just going to get my screen up, hopefully. Yeah, hopefully everyone can see that. And so this is Blender. And one of the downsides, I guess, of Blender is that it can actually feel a little bit overwhelming when you first see it. This is basically kind of what the default scene looks like when you first load Blender up. And again, there is a lot of different UI elements going on around here, lots of different things you can potentially press that changes how Blender interacts. I'm not going to really go into detail of most of them in this video because it's kind of a bit beyond the scope of teaching you how to make a basic 3D model. And so instead, I'm just going to kind of point out the bits that are really important to know. And then if we run into other bits as we're kind of modeling, I'll describe them as well. And so there's a couple of really crucial things when learning to 3D model. And the first one of those is being able to navigate the space. So obviously you're looking at this for a screen, I assume, much like I'm looking at my Blender for a screen. So that's a 2D, interface. And we're trying to work in 3D. And so what that means is it's really important that we know how to navigate around the 3D space of Blender to be able to accurately create a model in 3 dimensions. And so you should be able to see just over here on the left-hand side, you can actually see a kind of icon that looks like a mouse. And that mouse represents the different buttons I'm pressing. So when that middle one's highlighted, that's because I've got the middle mouse button, so the scroll wheel, actually clicked down. And so that's actually one of the easiest ways to begin navigating in Blender is through using the middle mouse button. So if you hold it down, that lets you orbit around the camera around the environment. And then if you hold Shift down whilst clicking the middle mouse button, what that lets you do is pan the camera around. And so for anyone that's maybe not navigated in 3D space before, this just navigating a 3D space through panning around and rotating will be potentially quite challenging. And I promise you it gets easier over time, but it's one of those things it's worth practicing because, again, the sooner you're competent and feel comfortable navigating the 3D space, the better modeler you'll become, basically. And then the last thing you can do with the mouse wheel, although this one's a bit more intuitive, is you can scroll in and out, and that zooms the scene in and out. You can also press like the period key on your number pad if you have a number pad, and that zooms you into whatever object you have selected. And that can be quite useful as well. The other aspect that I want to make sure everyone kind of feels comfortable with, because I'm going to be doing it whilst I'm modeling, is what we're looking at right now is a viewport. And that's how we're seeing the model in space. And right now we're seeing it from basically every angle that our camera's orbiting around. What you can do is you can actually fix the viewport to fixed angles. And so there's a few ways of doing this. I'm going to be using the numpad on the side of my keyboard. So for example, I'm going to press 1 on my numpad, and you'll see it's shifting the viewport. And it's now moved that viewport to a front perspective. And so that's useful for when I want to model from the front and when I want to look at stuff orthographically. So you see up here, it now says I'm orthographic. And what that means is it's not really rendering depth in the same way. And that's useful when you're trying to align objects. If I click my mouse to rotate again, it goes right back to perspective and disregards that front angle. And so 7, for example, in the viewport, that takes you to the top of your scene. So now we're viewing everything in our scene from the top down in kind of that bird's eye view. And again, when I'm modeling, you're going to see me swap to both of those, and maybe a couple of others as we're kind of going through, when I want to make sure I'm aligning stuff or when I just need to move stuff in a certain angle. The other way to do that, if you don't have a numpad, I'm aware some people might just have laptops or they might have a smaller keyboard. You can actually use this little gizmo up here that lets you click and rotate between the different viewports. And you can also click and hold to rotate like this, which is useful. Again, maybe you don't have a mouse, so holding the middle mouse button down is really difficult if you don't have one. And so you can actually recreate that by left clicking in this gizmo and rotating it around. I think that's basically everything around navigating the viewport. We'll see as I kind of go through. And so, as I mentioned, this is kind of the default scene of Blender. When you first load it up, there's this grid everywhere. You got your axes, you got your Y and your X here. You can't see the Z one at the moment, but Z goes up in Blender. If you've spent any time in game engines or maybe some other kind of modeling software, Z might actually be a horizontal direction or a horizontal axis for you. But at least in Blender, Z is up rather than Y being up. So that's actually a really useful thing to remember. Because again, as I mentioned, this kind of modeling, we're doing it for the purpose of bringing it into games engines to actually use as assets. And if a game engine has their up axis as Y, but Blender has it as Z, then you actually need to make sure you're aware of that so that when you bring the model in, you can change that so that it orientates itself correctly. And so in this default scene, you're going to see there's 2 different objects that you can select by clicking on. So you're going to see here that I'm right-clicking. But if you're just using the default Blender, it's actually just a left click. But left click for me does something else, simply because I've changed my keybinds to Blender to something I feel more comfortable. And you can do that just by going up to Edit and Preferences. And so that's actually one of the great bits of Blender is it's really customizable. And there's also tons of add-ons and kind of extra kind of scripts that you can bring in that recreate or do functions for you in a quicker manner. And because it's open source, everyone has access to that code base. So people have made some really crazy plugins and stuff that do interesting stuff to kind of speed your workflow up. An example of this is there's a really nice plugin that makes low poly rocks. So again, rocks is kind of, rocks and stones and boulders. That's quite a standard kind of game asset that we use a lot of the time. And there's a plugin you can bring into Blender that just generates a low poly rock using some procedural content generation algorithms. And then you can export that and bring it into your game. And that saves you having to model it, which is great. And that's one of the reasons I love Blender. So as I was saying, going back to this, we have these 2 things here. We have a directional light, or a sun, as they call it in Blender. And we're just going to press delete to get rid of that. And there's a camera as well. And I'm going to press delete to get rid of that. That way we basically have an empty scene. Because, again, we're making models with the goal of chucking them into a game engine, we don't need to worry about how they're being rendered inside Blender. We don't need to worry about how they're being lit inside Blender through the lights. So we just get rid of them to make the scene a little bit clearer, and it's easy for us to navigate. Now, the people that eagle-eyed and have been watching, they might have seen this little thing here, this red and white circle with a crosshair, and wondering what the hell that is, because it kind of lingers around in space and moves around whenever I left click. And so what this is the 3D cursor. And so it's kind of Blender's way of allowing you to have a cursor that moves through three-dimensional space. Again, right now, you can see, hopefully you can see my cursor, I'm pretty sure you can. You can see it only moves on X and Y, right? It moves on a 2D space. But sometimes you need to be able to, click something in 3D space or move something around in 3D space around a certain angle. And that is where this cursor is really, really valuable. You can, left click to move it around, but you can also change the X, Y, and Z positions, because obviously that's how coordinates are stored in 3D space through this little menu on the side here. And so I like to try and keep it at 0, 0, 0. But every now and then I'll left click, because I forget myself, I'll move it around. And by default, when you add like a new object to the scene inside Blender, it will spawn it wherever that 3D cursor is. And that might seem like an annoying thing to begin with, but it's actually a really useful thing, because it lets you decide where something's going to be created before you create it, so you don't then have to worry about moving it around. And it lets you be a bit more specific, because you can put in the exact position that you want an object to spawn and know that's where it's going to be created. So I think that's the basics of Blender. And so what I'm going to quickly do is, normally there would have also been a cube in the scene. And so I'm just going to add a cube. Don't worry about how I added that for now. It's not particularly relevant. I'm just going to get rid of that box there. And so, you'd also see this cube. Yours might be lighted slightly different, but again, don't worry about that, because we're not actually concerned with how it's rendering inside Blender. And so this is a cube. It's got 6 what we call faces. And what we can do is, Blender has 2 modes. It has object mode, which is what we're currently in. And we can see up in the top left corner, it says object mode. And then it has edit mode. And you can swap to edit mode by just clicking the drop down like that, or the tab key, if you're using a keyboard, can also swap between edit and object mode each time you press it. And again, you're going to see me use that tab key a lot to swap in between object and edit mode. And what that actually means is that when you're in object mode and I try and move something like this, it's moving the whole object. When I'm in edit mode, it's me actually editing bits of the object inside that when I move them. And so what's kind of useful is, you go into edit mode to make the changes to your model, to actually create your model. And then once you're done, you make sure in object mode to kind of finish it off, and then you can move it around and do whatever you kind of want to do with it next. So there's 3 kind of key buttons, or keys to remember inside Blender, that handle the majority of what we call the manipulation that you'd be doing on a model. So we have this cube right here. And so the first one is G for grab. And so if I press the G key, I grab whatever I have selected, and it will move around on the kind of mouse as I move it. There's R for rotate. So if I press R, you'll see that the cube is rotating around as I move my mouse around. And then the last one is S for scale. And so you can see as well on the screen, just above the mouse, it says what buttons I'm pressing. And S does exactly what you'd expect to. It scales the object up and down based on where I move the mouse. And so those 3 things consist of the bulk of what you actually use to manipulate and make models. Most of the time, it's just a case of moving vertices around, scaling faces up, rotating objects to kind of create the object you're eventually trying to make. One little interesting extra bit that you can actually do inside Blender is, say I've grabbed this object and I want to move it. You can actually press the axis that you want to kind of lock the movement to on the keyboard to lock that. So if we can see here, right, the Y axis is this green and the red one is X. And if I press X, you'll see that no matter however I move my mouse, it's locked. And again, that's really useful because, again, when you're working in 3D space, like if I just try and grab and move this around, I don't really know exactly where it's going, right? And it's moved over there now because that's the nature of kind of trying to translate 2D movement to 3D space. But if I lock how I'm moving it, that means I can kind of guarantee where it's going to end up. And again, that's really useful to know and something that you'll see me use quite a lot. And so if we just go into edit mode by pressing tab, and so again, I said this is a cube, and I said this has 6 faces. And so by default, top left corner, you'll see there's these 3 little boxes. Hopefully you can make them out on the stream. And so we have vertex select, edge select, and face select. And again, those are the 3 things you're going to be clicking the most to modify bits of the model, right? To manipulate the model into the shape that you're trying to make. And so these are faces. And so obviously a face consists of a bunch of vertices that are connected with edges. And then once those edges are connected, it becomes a face. And so you see right here. So this, did I move that in? No, I did. So this is a face on the top. And if I click on edge, you'll see the green highlight changes ever so slightly. If I go wireframe, you'll be able to see that easier. There we go. So you can see this is an edge, like that I'm clicking on now. And then this would be a face, right? The entire kind of flat portion of it. And then vertexes are these points in 3D space that we then use to connect everything. You don't really need to understand or worry about understanding kind of the logic of how all these are created at the moment, because like I said, this is just a basic how to make a 3D model. But that's basically every single 3D model you've ever seen in the game is kind of comprised of vertices and edges and faces, and also tries, but that's a slightly different topic. Cool. So let's just go back into my solid rendering. So let's actually get started on modeling. Now I've kind of given a whirlwind tour of kind of Blender's interface. So as I mentioned, what we're going to be doing today is modeling some Christmassy themed things. So the plan is we're going to start with a snowman. And now I've picked that, on purpose because a snowman is actually a relatively simple object. We can break that down quite easily, right? If you think about what comprises a snowman, typically it's 3 spheres that are stacked on top of each other. They get a bit smaller for each ascending sphere. And then there's normally some sort of sticks or arms of some sort. And then, there's a carrot nose and potentially some facial features. And so we can kind of go about modeling each of those bits separately and then bung them all together. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So I'm going to make sure I'm in object mode. And I'm actually going to just press delete to get rid of that cube. Because again, we're making a snowman. We're going to start with that sphere. So a cube doesn't really make sense. So to add a new object in Blender, you can press the shortcut key Shift-A. And that basically brings up a list of all the different things you can add. And we're just going to go onto mesh because we're interested in adding meshes. So that's things like cubes, cylinders, and other kind of 3D shapes. And we are going to add a icosphere. And so you should see something like this will be added to your scene. Now, before you click anything else, every time you perform what we call like a modifier in Blender, or if you add a object in Blender, there will be this little box down here. You might have to click on the arrow to bring it up. And this box basically has some different variables or values that you can change based on whatever modifier or object you just added. So we just added an icosphere, so the box has changed to icosphere. And we can see we can change how many subdivisions it has. And what that means is basically how many times all of the faces are divided to make more faces. So the more subdivisions, the more faces, or in this case tries, a model has, and the more high fidelity it is, basically. Now, I'm not interested in making a really smooth snowman. I kind of go for like that low poly aesthetic. One, because it's typically easier to teach with, but two, I'm not a particularly good artist. And so by doing low poly, we kind of skirt around that issue, hopefully. So I'm going to leave it on. I'm going to leave it on 2 subdivisions, right? I think that's more than enough faces for our snowman. And I'm just going to minimize that. And so this is going to be the first base kind of sphere of the snowman. And so I'm just going to press 1 to go to the front, and I press S, and we're just going to scale this up a little bit because I want it to be big. And then I'm going to move it up by pressing G to grab, and then I'm pressing Z to lock it this direction, and I'm just going to move it up there so that the base of the snowman, like where the snowman would start in a game world, is actually on a level, it's actually at 0, basically. Because otherwise what could happen if we kept it there, like in the middle, so 0 is the middle of that sphere, when we go to then instantiate it in a game engine like Unity or Unreal, it would instantiate half in the floor because its origin point is here. And we don't want that. So I'm just going to move that back up. There we go. Should we make it a little bit bigger? Now, as I said, a snowman is 3 balls. And so that actually makes our life really easy. Because what we can do is when we have this object in edit mode, we have all of the faces currently selected, which is indicated by the fact that they're glowing. So you can see we can select each individual face. But what we want to make sure is we have all of them selected. You can do that by pressing A, and that just selects everything in that object. And I'm just going to press Shift and then D. And what that's going to do is it's going to duplicate. Or it should have duplicated. There we go. And so what we're doing is we're just making another copy of that sphere, but it's inside the model. So it's not a separate object. It's still one object, but it now has 2 spheres in it. And so after pressing Shift D, if you then press G, you'll see you're able to move it around just as you normally were able to. And I'm just going to press Z again to lock it on that direction. And I'm going to move it to a reasonable area. And I'm just going to have it go in a little bit so it kind of feels like it is actually sitting on that snowball underneath. And say that's probably just fine, actually. And guess what? We're going to do that exact same thing again. So we're going to press Shift D to duplicate, G to grab, and then we're not going to do it. There we go. Yeah. So sometimes with Blender, after you perform a modifier, you just need to press Enter to make sure that that modification is complete, and then you can move. So I'm going to press G again, and then Z again. We'll go back to that frontal view so I can just kind of see it from this angle. And we're just going to bring that down. And kind of go, yep, that looks like the beginnings of a snowman. Now, we might not be entirely happy with maybe the shape of this. Maybe, if you ever made a snowman in real life, sometimes this first ball that you've rolled up kind of begins to melt or squishes down under the weight of the other ones. And so maybe you want to like slightly tweak that. And so what we can do is we can click on one of the faces on this sphere at the bottom and press L. And that will basically select all of the linked faces, which saves us, the other way of doing that would be to manually click on all of these. And as you can imagine, that would take quite a while. There's some other ways of selecting, but the easiest one is just to press L when you have one selected, and it selects all of the linked faces. That's a really powerful feature of Blender. And then I'm just going to actually go back to front, and we're just going to scale it down on Z ever so slightly, just so it's a little bit squashed, and then move it back down. And I'm going to do the same with this one, scale it slightly, and move it a little bit more down. And I'm going to keep the head because it doesn't really have much weight on it. I'm going to keep that the same and just move that down. So that's the basis of our snowman. And so now what we can actually do is start adding some of the other features. So I'm going to give our snowman a little top hat because I think that'll make him look nice and fancy. And to do that, again, we want to kind of break down what a top hat is. And because we're kind of dealing with low poly, a top hat is essentially a cylinder that then has a wide bit at the bottom. And so that's exactly how we're going to make it. So we're going to press Shift A, and we're going to add a cylinder. So it's added it down here at the cursor, as I mentioned earlier, right? Anytime you add a new mesh, it gets added to the 3D cursor position. And we have that same pop-up box here that says, that defines some of the different values of that mesh. And so I'm just going to change the vertices down just so it's not as high poly. Because again, I'm trying to make this low poly look. And we can see it affecting each time I kind of click. And I think 14's probably still a bit too high, actually. There we go. Let's go for a nice even number. Let's go for 10. So I'm going to just minimize that again. And I'm going to move my top hat up. And we're going to click on this top face. And we'll go G and then Z. And we're just going to move just that face. So with Blender, you can actually select any edge, face, or vertex, and move them by themselves. And again, that's how you start actually making a model. And so we have this hat here. And so actually, I'm just going to quickly, hopefully select blink. There we go. And we're going to move it down so it's actually sitting on the snowman's head. I'm going to rotate it ever so slightly. And don't worry too much. So you see here, like we see some of the mesh of the spheres clipping through. Don't worry about that too much at all. For this type of model, that's fine. Because we're just making a simple model that would kind of be a static mesh in a game. If you were trying to make a model that you plan to maybe animate or rig, you'd actually probably want to fix these kind of issues. And what you'd ideally make is what we call like a seamless mesh, where it's just one mesh for the whole object, where right now we can already see we have 4 different meshes for our object. But for the purpose that we're using it for, 1, teaching some basic modeling, and 2, not to actually be animated in the game, this is absolutely fine. So don't worry if you see bits of things clipping through. And so, yeah, I think that's a suitable base of the hat. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click back on this face again. And I'm going to press I. And what that does is it's called inset. And what it lets you do is add another face, or inset a face on an existing face. And so we can use that. We can inset to make this new face here. And then the other feature that I'm going to use a lot today is extrude. And so if I press E, you're going to see it lets you basically extrude another face from that face, saying the word face a lot, to make a hat. And so you can keep, if you wanted more detail, you could keep extruding, and you can move those extrusions around each time to make whatever you kind of want. And that's actually the basis of a modeling principle that we call box modeling, where you start with a single mesh like a cube, and you just extrude and subdivide the mesh until you get the shape you need. So yeah, that's the basis of his hat. I think that actually looks quite nice. I'm just going to scale the top of his hat up just so it's got like a little bit more character. And we're actually going to add a loop cut or a ring cut, depending on what kind of modeling software you're in. And so you can do that by when you're in edit mode, you can press Control R, and it will basically showcase this like highlight of where it's going to make a cut. And so I'm just going to chuck that there. That's fine for now. And so what a cut is, right, is if you remember when I showed you that cube, it was 6 faces, and then each face was attached to 4 vertices, and then that allowed it to exist, right, and allow it to be rendered. And so when you add a cut, what you're actually doing is adding some more vertices along each of these edges to allow for more movement to happen. Because like what I want to do here is scale this in slightly to to, again, give the hat a bit more depth. So we're just going to scale that in. How do we want it? Yeah, like that. There we go. And that just lets us add a bit more detail to the model. And again, you can keep, through extrusions and through ring cuts and through subdivisions, you can actually keep adding more detail to that model until you kind of have what you're after. But again, since we're just going for kind of low poly, I'm just going to stop there with a hat. So that's the hat. Let's actually tackle the arms next. And so to do that, we're actually going to follow a really similar process in that we're going to Shift A to add a mesh, and we're going to click on cylinder. And we've already got our cylinder here. It retains the values that we set last time, so I'm not going to touch them. I'm just going to move it up. I'm going to go to my front viewport because I want to be able to basically only change and modify this from this angle for a couple of seconds. And so we're going to rotate it. And then I'm going to scale it on, actually let's do it this way. We're going to scale it on Z to make them kind of long, because obviously he doesn't have short stubby arms, or at least not the way I'm envisioning him. And then we need to make that significantly thinner, because right now his arms would be as chunky as he is. And so we can do that by actually pressing scale and then pressing Shift and Z. And so I realize that's quite a complex series of key presses. So what Blender lets you do is, if you don't want to scale across all the different axes at once, you can use the Shift modifier and then the axis that you don't want to scale on. And so now, because we've pressed Shift Z, it won't scale the Z dimension at all. It will only scale on the X and Y. And so I'll show you the difference, right? If I just press S and don't press Shift Z, everything scales up when I move my mouse, or scales down. Where if I press S and then Shift Z, we see that now when I move it, it's not scaling on Z, it's just scaling on X and Y, which allows us to make nice little thin stick arms that I'm actually made too long. So we're just going to scale them a little bit shorter. And then we're going to move them over to where his arms would be. And we're just going to rotate and go to the top to see actually they're not really, I want them to be roughly on the center of the body. Yeah, actually that looks about right. And then we're gonna, how should we do this? Let's add another Icosphere. Bring it up here, scale it right down. It's in the right position. So, I mentioned at the beginning that it's really important to know how to basically navigate around 3D space. And that's what we're doing here, right? I'm navigating around that 3D space just to make sure that this sphere is in the location I thought it was going to be, right? So it's actually in the correct area. And then go back to front, and I'm going to click on one of these, press L to link it, and then Shift D to duplicate. I'm actually going to rotate, scale this down, and then we're going to do the same, duplicate one more time and rotate. So we've got kind of a little hand. Now, we could do the exact same again to model the snowman's left hand, if this is the front. And, we could make a new cylinder, we could add a new sphere, we could keep duplicating. But the nice thing about working in a digital bit of software is we don't have to draw everything twice. We've already made it. So what we can do is, through clicking on all these, pressing L, just zoom it in there to make sure I've actually got it selected. You can select all of these. We can press Shift D to duplicate it. Right now we've got another hand. So that's one of the really powerful things about kind of modeling software, is it lets you kind of ease that workload. I mean, if we were so inclined to make some sort of alien snowman, it's absolutely no problem. Not that we're going to, but you can very easily, right? Or maybe it's a spider snowman, I'm not sure. But I'm just going to Control Z to get rid of those duplications, because I don't want them there. Let me just move that in the right space. And so much like I added that little ring cut for detail on the hat, I'd probably do something similar on the arms, just to make them look a bit more like a stick. I doubt you've ever seen a stick that's perfectly smooth and straight. So we're just going to add like a ring cut down here. Maybe we scale that in. And maybe we add another one up here. Scale that one out a little bit. You can see right away that's added, again, a little bit more character to the model, right? If actually, let's do the fingers as well, since we're here. I'm just adding those ring cuts and just tweaking them ever so slightly. Zoom in a little bit more. So there, I accidentally made a mistake, right? And I think it's useful to point out, one, everyone makes mistakes whilst modeling, and this is an absolute classic one to make. I selected this ring here, because I wanted to move it around, but I also had this edge here selected, because I was holding Shift at the time. And so what that means is now, when I move them with G, it's moving everything. And so I can just hold Shift and right-click that to unselect it, because I do only just want to move this one. And actually, I think that looks a bit weird, so we're just going to bring that in, bring it up maybe. Yeah, there we go. Kind of looks like he's got slightly sticky fingers now. There we go. Perfect. So we're just going to do the same on the other arm. So adding a ring cut, scaling it down, add another one over here. We're going to make this one look a little bit more jaggedy, like this. And we do the same for those fingers. There we go. So now we've got a skeleton that has a nice little top hat and some suitable arms. The other kind of things I think about, at least when I'm thinking about snowmen, is a nose. Well, basically a nose and the rest of the facial features, and then the kind of buttons that go down the, I think they're normally like rocks, right? And so let's do the nose quickly. And so when we think of a nose, I think kind of one of the traditional things like a carrot. So a carrot is kind of like a cone shape. And so one of the kind of the tricky things, I guess, when you're trying to learn to model is being able to break down what shapes everything, what every kind of shape is and how you can kind of get towards that shape. So again, we saw with the top hat, I kind of broke that down into a cylinder that then has a flat cylinder at the bottom. And so with a carrot, to me, I think a cone's the easiest kind of starting point there. So I'm just going to go down and add a cone. And again, this is going to be way too kind of high definition for what we're doing. So I'm just going to bring this right down. Yeah, there we go. 5 sounds about right. Then we're just going to minimize this because we're going to change the other bits afterwards. And I'm going to go to front, press G and Z to move it directly up. And then I have to press 3 here to go to the side. So this is the side view, and I'm just going to rotate this. And we're going to work on it. Before I slap it onto the snowman's face, we're just going to actually tweak it now, basically. So I'm going to go to vertex select this edge one, make that longer, and then we can select face, L, scale this down. So again, I don't want to do this. Yeah, I think this just needs to be scaled down entirely, actually. So we just bring it down. That's about right. And then we're going to use my favorite. We're going to use a ring cut, hopefully. Or do we need to subdivide it because there's not enough information there for a ring cut? Yeah. So yeah, I'm pressing Control R to try and add a ring cut, and you can see it's not letting me. And that's because there's basically just there's not enough vertexes here to make a ring cut to begin with. And so what we can do is if I select all these faces, hopefully, there we go. And if we subdivide, so you can always subdivide a face or a mesh to make more faces in it, essentially, right? And that's kind of, as I said, it adds more fidelity, but it also makes it trickier to work with. But that's not exactly what I wanted, and that it's now added this nice series of edges here that I can then use to scale, and then we're gonna do that to kind of slightly tweak this snowman's nose. So I'm actually going to move some of these vertices, vertexes independently, just to kind of make it look like his nose is, a little bit jagged. You're not going to put your best carrots on the snowman, I imagine. And so once I'm happy with that, which I'm going to say I am, go back to that face mode, press L for that link select, and then just slap it straight into the snowman. And I'm going to say I'm fairly happy with that. Yeah. So let's do the eyes, and then we're almost done. And so with the eyes, I'm just going to use spheres, and then we're going to slightly kind of shape the spheres so they look correct at least. And so yeah, I think that's probably slightly too high poly. Yeah, so I moved it down to one subdivision for this. And let's just move this. We're going to go to front view, just because it's going to be easier to see and work with. Scale this right down. Go to side view, move it so it's actually sticking out. Yeah, I think that looks fine. And so you could kind of, you can mess with the shape of the snowman here. So, I could kind of grab this vertex and kind of maybe try and make his eyes look a bit more like eyes rather than just rocks. But you could also just be perfectly happy with just chucking those rocks straight on. Yeah, I think that's pretty good, actually. And so I'm just going to go back to face, so we can link select. And then we're going to press, we're going to go top, Shift D to duplicate. We're just going to move that eye to the other side. I'm going to rotate it slightly so it looks a bit different. And I'm going to make it a little bit bigger as well. And chance of you making a snowman that had perfectly symmetrical eyes is pretty unlikely. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. And so I'm just going to link select this eye again, go to front, Control D, sorry, Shift D to duplicate, scale that down. We're just going to quickly do that for his mouth. He's meant to look happy, but he's beginning to look a little bit creepy. That certainly wasn't my intention, but that seems to be how he's turned out. Ah, well. So, yeah, I think that's fine. And then there's one more thing we need to do, and that is actually apply some kind of texture and some colors to this snowman before it'd be ready to move into a game engine. And so what I'm going to do is at the top, there's a bunch of different tabs, basically for different layouts. And so I'm just going to click on the UV editing tab. And what you'll see is that's going to open up a different window. And it's going to open up a viewport. And then it's also going to open up this window here where you can see your textures. Now, I've already brought in a texture that I found online. If you just kind of go to Google and type in color palette, that's basically what I did to find this one. There's a couple of really good sites that generate different color palettes. And what you can do is once you've downloaded that, you can basically just drag it from your Explorer, wherever you downloaded it. You can drag it straight into this area here inside Blender, and it will recognize it as a texture and it will import it. And that's actually a really easy way to do it. And then once it's in here, what we can actually start doing is assigning each of these faces to a color. So there's many different ways of texturing models. But this is definitely the simplest and one of the easiest. We're not going to go into hand painting or kind of proper UV unwrapping today. And so what I'm going to do is click on this, press L to do a select. Same with that one. And then there's the amount so I can move. And then same with that one. And so you'll see in this UV editor, it now has all of these faces selected. So one of the things with textures is obviously it has to convert what is essentially a 3D object onto a 2D space, right? Because textures are 2D, they can't be 3D. And so this is what this is what a sphere looks like when you convert it to 2D, and obviously that's kind of nasty. Like I said, there's entire jobs around UV unwrapping correctly and kind of the processes for that, but we're not interested in that today. So what I'm going to do is select all of that with A, and I'm going to press S to scale. All of the shortcuts in Blender are the same regardless of what window you're in, and I'm going to press 0. And what that's going to do is basically stack every single face on top of each other into a very small space. And I'm going to drag them by pressing G and move them to the white area. And so if we make sure we actually assign that material over here, we should be able to see. So one, don't worry about all of this being broken, but you can see this should be now white, I hope. Let's just test that. Yeah, it is. Good. Looks more gray than white, but that's partly because it's being rendered inside Blender's engine. And so as much as I love the rainbow spectrum snowman that we've made, I do want to assign these faces properly. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to quickly go into solid, and I was going to turn the textures off, but I won't bother. So we need to basically select all of the rocks, or the things that are meant to be rocks, and just put a decent texture on them. So I'm going to do that again. Shift, select, then L. Now I can see Chris in the chat saying that the snowman's creepy. It wasn't meant to be creepy, but it definitely has kind of come across as a slightly edgy snowman. And so that's it really looks like that. Chris asked quite a good question. Can you shade the edges differently? And so I guess what spurred that is obviously the way it's being rendered in Blender right now. Is you can see each of these edges has like a highlight. But what that is actually, that's just something I have turned on in Blender to make it easier for when you're modeling to see faces. When we bring this into a game engine, that wouldn't be reflected. It would just be a flat white color, no edge highlights. You could highlight those edges in a texture, but that would require you to unwrap each of the kind of faces and kind of hand paint that texture, or use a fancy shader to do that inside Unity or Unreal or whatever engine you're using. But yeah, I just personally like having clarity turned on because I find it easier to model. So I think that's all the rocks. And so again, I'm just going to go back into my UV, press A, scale 0, and then move them over to the rocks. Let's do the same with the top hat. L, A, S, 0. S0, there we go. Move that there. I don't know why I did his nose. I wasn't thinking. Let's do that as the right color. Green. Actually, I don't like that. Let's go change it, but it looks better that way. And then we just need to do his arms. And again, I'm just pressing L to do that linked select there. Okay, let's go down to 0. Move it over to, I guess, the woodiest looking one we have. Probably this. Almost the same as his nose. And so this is kind of a limitation of the color palette I've chosen. Does that look okay? No, I don't like that. That one. Yeah, sure, that's fine by me at least. What should we actually no, let's go with that one. Okay, there we go. So let's go back to our main layout so we can actually see a decent image. And so if I edit object, if we go to object mode, that is our model, right? So we've made a snowman with really just some primitives and moving them around and just doing a couple of simple modifiers, right? Just through extruding a couple of times and through using lots of loop cuts to add some of that interesting detail. And like I said, inside, that's more what it would look like inside a game engine, but it probably wouldn't have some of this specular kind of highlight and reflections, because again, I'd flat shade this inside a game engine. So that's it for what I kind of wanted to go through today. Hopefully you found that useful as a kind of super introductory way to model in Blender. It can get and does get significantly more complex. And, we made this model in like 40 minutes with me kind of talking through it. But, people spend absolute hundreds of hours on making kind of character rigs that you kind of see in the AAA game space, normally with teams of, lots of people. I've not seen any questions in the chat, at least, but, if anyone does have any questions, reach out to me either via email, khicks@lincoln.ac.uk, or you can find me on Twitter as well as Kieran Hicks. And yeah, I hope you all enjoyed this little kind of lecture walkthrough of how to make a model in Blender. And I hope you all have a good Christmas as well. Thanks for watching.